Hello, Earthlings, and happy World Vegan Day. So, this is a World Vegan Day special, and it's about a very important guy in terms of the vegan social movement history, and that's Leslie Cross. A couple of things to say before we start, which is that I've left Cross's original language intact, as it were, so it will appear to be dated and sexist, this kind of stuff. And the second thing is, the usual caveat is that when we talk about the vegan social movement, we're talking about the first group of people that came together to make a social movement organization, the Vegan Society. And of course, they named their social movement veganism. No other claim is being made apart from the fact that these were the first people that we know about who came together to make a social movement and named it. Okay, so with all that said and done, welcome to the Time Tunnel. Yes, indeed. So, Leslie Cross. Now, in my view, Leslie Cross is one of the most significant figures in the history of the vegan social movement. This story goes back to 1949, when Cross points out that the Vegan Society, which hadn't been going that long, 5 years, did not have a definition of veganism, as opposed to having a definition of the vegan diet. So he sets about working on this, evolving vegan philosophy in a series of essays in the Vegan magazine or the Vegan Journal. It's a very slow process, of course. This is before the age of the internet. It's some of Cross's lengthy process of thinking aloud that this time tunnel is about. Now, there's a bit of an irony, really, because all the essays now are available on the internet. So I'll say a little bit more about that later. I also want to say a few words about the potential issue between Donald Watson and Leslie Cross. They did appear to have a complicated relationship, perhaps. Was it a bit of rivalry? Perhaps we'll never kind of know. There are some claims about that. But I think it's clear that Cross's writings served to radicalize Donald Watson. And at the same time, Watson's 1945 declaration that veganism is about opposing the exploitation of sentient life is likely to have influenced Cross. And so Cross cites that 1945 line from Watson in his 1949 essay, In Search of Veganism 1. There's two, In Search of Veganism 1 and 2. It's this essay in which Cross points out that veganism doesn't have a definition. So we're going to talk about that. In terms of what's on the screen, I always like to point out, as did Matthew Cole, the vegan sociologist, now these are the years when the strapline of the vegan was advocating living without exploitation. So I'm suggesting that the Watson-Cross relationship was complex and there may have been elements of rivalry. That is certainly the claim of Leslie Cross's son, John. Whatever the truth, it is fair to say that whenever Watson said anything publicly about Leslie Cross, he was always very warm and full of compliments. For example, he says, I hesitate to single out anyone, but I would say Leslie Cross and Arthur Ling must be put in the records as being the two outstanding, faithful contributors to our cause. And talking about Cross, he says, he was certainly one of the outstanding people who have served the movement, and in retirement he went up and down the country, giving his lecture, The Milk of Human Kindness, all voluntarily, of course, paying his own expenses. Now, in both of those tributes, the emphasis is put on Cross's work in developing plant milks, Plamil, and his work with Arthur Ling. Now, this particular time tunnel will not delve into that aspect of Cross's work. I want to stick with the more important stuff in a way about the development of vegan philosophy. Elsie Shrigley would agree that Cross was very influential and a very significant player in the early history of the vegan movement. In fairness, though, non-dairy vegetarians, as they were known then, they were asking moral questions long before 1943. And it's 1943 that this little clip is focused on. I believe that what Shrigley is getting at is that this was the final thing that galvanized the small group of soon-to-be vegans. Now, the Vegetarian Society play an important role at this stage. They did a massive favor for veganism when they refused a request that they facilitate a non-dairy section of the Vegetarian Society. I have covered this in more detail in other time tunnels on the women pioneers of the movement and in the time tunnel about Donald Watson. The short version is that a group of people were faced in 1944 with starting a brand new social movement from scratch, something they didn't, as it were, bank on. It took them a few years to get organized and sort themselves out, but they did do a marvelous job in the immediate aftermath of war. So here we have Samantha Calvert, the head of communication and historian of the Vegan Society, summarizing the problem identified by Cross in 1949. There are a number of movement issues that still exist today, but I believe that Cross's attempt was an attempt to tread very carefully towards a joint understanding of what veganism is, what it's all about. Cross says that there's a great deal behind the simple question, what is veganism? He says it will not do for members to simply state veganism is this or veganism is that. That's because people are really saying my idea of veganism is this or that. And of course, we still get that in the modern day. He says actually it was probably a good thing that the society had not rushed into defining veganism in its first years. This goes back to the Vegetarian Society refusal, because they did not know they were going to be running their own independent social movement, as I said. So the idea of non-dairy vegetarianism is rapidly left behind, as is the first proposed definition mentioned by Calvert, the principle of the emancipation of animals from exploitation by men. Calvert states that this was later clarified to seek an end to the use of animals by man for food, commodities, work, hunting, vivisection, and by all other uses involving exploitation of animal life by man. Now, for all the modern day fuss about what's claimed to be the rock-solid definition of veganism, Cross was actually rather fast and loose with the actual wording over several attempts and over several years. For example, in 1974, and admittedly that is looking back at this stage, he says that veganism, which to me, breaking his own rule there, which to me means and always will mean the philosophy that man should, for his own advancement, live without exploiting animals. So as Cross slowly thinks through vegan values, it's clear from the essays that the idea of what veganism is expands exponentially. At the same time, he maintained for many years that it's necessary to produce a very concise definition of veganism. He argued this is a movement need. So I suggest that it's clear from reading his essays in full, and that's the only fair way of reading Cross, that the principle of the emancipation of animals from exploitation by man was a starting point and was not the end of the matter. Now, There are small groups of vegans known as animals-only vegans who argue that veganism should end with that concise definition and, in a sense, go nowhere else. They claim that from at least 6 full essays spanning 6 years, veganism can be fully articulated by 9 words. And these are: the doctrine that man should live without exploiting animals, which Cross declared to be the official definition in 1954. For the animals-only vegans, then, these 9 words encapsulate the full meaning of veganism. However, I believe that the fullest understanding must go back to the history and the evolution of Cross's writings. He had a methodical process which went back to 1949. Cross said that the Vegan Society would need at some point to have an AGM or an EGM to agree things by majority consent. He tells his readers that the Vegan Society has evolved a long way in a short time, which is certainly true and in fact probably an understatement. And he provides a sort of literature review to describe their journey thus far. So this is Cross's lit review in Search of Veganism 1, and Cross outlines the things already said about veganism. There's no need to go through this in detail. You could pause the video if you want to look at exactly what Cross wrote. But I think the last entry is significant, as is Cross's comments in brackets, because Cross cites Watson's 1945 statement and comments. This is a considerable widening of the original non-dairy motivation. I believe that Cross resolved the potential contradiction of needing a very concise definition. And of course, this is at a time when the idea of veganism was growing more and more elaborate, almost by the day, by coming up with what I've called the focus and scope of veganism. Leslie Cross doesn't actually use the word focus and scope in his essays. Instead, he talks about 2 broad aspects of veganism. In fact, Cross does not explicitly say the phrase the first broad aspect of veganism, but in 1951, in an essay titled The New Constitution, he talks about how the vegan aim is not to make the present relationship between man and animal more tolerable. He then says that the second broad aspect of the vegan aim is its beneficial effects upon human evolution. And it's that line that implies the existence of the first aspect. Indeed, in this very essay, he says that there may be other aspects too, and those are the ones that touch on practical movement issues, such as whether it would be a good idea to allow full and associate members of the Vegan Society, for example. So Cross did believe that the definition needs to be in the form of a principle from which certain practices logically devolve, and not in the form of a set of practices or aims. He said that they'd embarked upon a voyage of discovery. So this is how Cross begins the second part of In Search of Veganism. Thinking about the process the vegan movement has gone through to date, Cross says that there was an early tendency to get at the roots of the relationship between man and the animals, to deal with the cause rather than its almost uncountable symptoms. And he says there's no evidence that veganism was fundamentally concerned with anything other than man plus animal relationship. The end section is Cross's emphasis, but the words in bold are mine. So, here's a question. Does that mean that Cross is an animals-only vegan after all, as some have suggested and some have hoped for? No, I don't believe this is the case. The key wording here is fundamentally concerned, for he says in the very next sentence that This relationship is veganism's paramount, but not only concern. And so this, again, is a real lesson on not cherry-picking individual sentences from Cross. To understand Cross needs to be read in its fullness. Cross suggests actually that the existing literature from Watson reinforces his view. He cites an address on veganism by Donald Watson from 1947. This contains many phrases such as the right approach to the problem of animal emancipation, to be true emancipators of animals. The vegan renounces the superstition that continued human existence depends upon the exploitation of these creatures, and the time has come for us boldly to renounce the idea that we have the right to exploit animals. I read that line a couple of times and often fell into the Star Trek problem, but I think I did okay on that one. And at the end of the paragraph, Cross writes, "The thread that runs through the literature on this point is a conviction that for the sake of both man and his fellow creatures, the animals must one day be freed from his exploitations." It's interesting that they use the phrase exploitations rather than exploitation in their writing. It's my contention then that we are seeing here the first rehearsal of the focus and the scope of veganism. Also, it's abundantly clear from these early writings that there is absolutely no suggestion, none whatsoever, that the focus of veganism should be anything other than human relations with our fellow animals. The focus has always remained the same. It always will, as far as I can see. There's no threat to it. So Cross says that these observations lead to the following. So this is a six-part schema that he came up with. Number one, veganism is reform. Number two, the impelling element, the driving element, is compassion for animals arising from the treatment meted out to them by man. Number three, the fundamental concern is with the meeting point between the world of man and the world of animals. 4. Its existence presupposes maladjustment at that point. 5. Its purpose must be the correction of that maladjustment. 6. The maladjustment is intimately connected with man's use of animals, more precisely with his habit of acting as a parasite upon living creatures who cannot successfully resist his will. Cross argued then that any definition of veganism must contain these six observations and must not violate any one of them. And Cross says that a form of words which meets these requirements is veganism is the principle of the abolition of the exploitation of animals by man, and argued that the positive aspects of this negative, this non-exploitation approach, is the granting of freedom, or in a word he says, emancipation. Veganism may therefore be defined as the principle of the emancipation of the animals from exploitation by man. But there's more to it. Cross says that this definition does meet those six observations, but that in itself is not enough. They must also meet the requirements of wisdom and the requirements of logic, and be measured against a general philosophical argument. Cross suggests that the broad demand which wisdom makes upon man is that he shall free himself from the chains which bind him to his less noble desires, and inhibit his ascent to higher standpoints, wider vision, and consequent happiness. There are a number of tests by which his efforts to free himself may be judged, and one of the most stringent is his conduct towards those over whom he has power. It is applied in an acute form at the point where his world meets the world of animals. Now, his conduct, or humanity's conduct at this point, and Cross is talking about his present day, so we talk about the 1950s, reveals tendencies that are strongly self-indulgent at the expense of the creatures. There is a widespread failure to understand that animals have rights relatively equal to his, or to humanity. That's Cross's emphasis. His exploitations results in a needless curtailment of the natural freedom over a wide front, and inevitably end in one sort of slaughterhouse or another. Again, Cross's emphasis. It is true of all his exploitations, from backyard hens to the great beef and dairy herds. So that was my emphasis. I emphasised the issue of backyard hens to highlight the abolitionist nature of Cross's position. What became known as factory farming was already known and was growing fast in the 1950s, so they would have known about it, but that wasn't necessarily their focus. Their focus was on all animal use. And speaking about other issues of the day, Cross points out, for example, that some horses will end their days in what he called homes of rest, and this could apply to a few horses, but only a few. Most are killed, he says, for commodities, feeding stuffs, or human consumption. And he also talks about worn-out cows, or spent cows, from the dairy herd. They are not pensioned off, he says, in clover fields. So he's trying to put some reality to the situation. Now, the pioneers of our movement talked about how veganism should be considered to be central to the moral evolution of humanity. Now, some people have suggested that this human aspect of veganism are little more than mere knock-on benefits to the general commitment to animal liberation. Now, I tend to think that that is a shallow interpretation of things, especially when Watson had argued that the spread of vegan values would mark the greatest peaceful revolution ever known. That veganism is the only movement that can save humanity. And why? Because it's the greatest cause on earth, which is a quote that Matthew Cole used as a book chapter title. Cross said that why do we believe we should live without exploiting animals? The final, if not the immediate answer, is a revealing one, for it demonstrates the truth of the claim that veganism is not a mere side shoot in human evolution, but a central extending growth of considerable significance. Now, the passage on your screen, this is in Search of Veganism 2, again 1949, reveals a theme that Cross would develop fully in later essays, because both he and Watson fully expected that veganism would do a lot of work for humans, as well as doing a lot of work for our fellow animals, of course. As we have seen, Donald Watson declared that veganism is the only movement capable of saving humanity, while Cross's work is replete with lines such as, because he would free himself from many of the demands made by his lower nature, the benefits of veganism to man himself would be incalculable. So all this brings us to the Surge of Freedom from 1954. Now, this is a very important document in the history of our movement. What's interesting about the Surge is that it begins with the scope of veganism and not the focus, suggesting that veganism does a lot for humanity, as much as freeing the slaves and as much as freeing the serfs. And then he addresses that 9-word definition. Cross says that this definition is accurate, precise, and comprehensive. So we are back to the social movement need, as he saw it, for a concise definition about what it's all about. However, Cross says, and this is not surprising, that this definition is not well understood. Well, kind of, oh boy, if it wasn't understood in 1954, he should get himself a time machine and see what the state of the movement is right now. Why is it not well understood? I think simply because these 9 words cannot possibly really do justice to what veganism is. Veganism, Cross claims, is massive, and the achievement of the vegan aim will bring with it a new humanity to inhabit a new world. There's no way that 9 words can mean all of that. In reality, the writings of Cross, and indeed other pioneers from the 1960s into the 1990s, reveal the truth that these 9 words provide a definition of the focus of veganism, but not veganism as a whole. The Surge of Freedom is Leslie Cross's final formal essay on vegan philosophy. It was written 3 years after the essays most favoured by the animals-only activists. It's available online, as I said, and there are audio versions of all of Cross's essays, narrated by vegan filmmaker Andy Atkinson. You need to look on YouTube and you search Andy Atkinson, bracket, not your mum, not your milk, bracket. In The Surge, Cross repeats the issue of the 2 broad aspects of veganism, framed here now as the obvious and the not so obvious elements. He says that for veganism to succeed, there will have to be an immense change of heart and mind of humanity. There's going to be no butcher's shops, of course. If milk is still delivered in the future, it will be vegan milk. Cows will no longer cry for their calves. There will obviously be no slaughterhouses, no vivisection and no hunting. The less obvious changes see those benefits to humanity which Cross describes as incalculable. Humans living kindlier and more enlightened lives. Cross forecasts that human health, both physical and mental, would improve vastly. Living in a non-violent world would do us good. Humans would cast off a great deal of the coarser parts of our nature, and the benefits will shower on humanity as a result. Now, Leslie Cross died in December 1979, and this is his death notice printed in the Vegan Spring 1980 edition, and it's written by Kathleen Janaway. Sadly, and I don't really know the reason for this, the notice focuses on his work to develop plant milks rather than his much more important work to develop the philosophy of veganism. Now, some people, including his son John Cross, believe that the vegan movement did not treat Leslie Cross very well. This is an article written by Nicole Cross, no relation as far as I know, and Luis Torres, and they accused the Vegan Society of dissolving into animal welfarism after Leslie Cross's involvement. They claim that the vegan has trampled on the legacy of the early vegan movement pioneers, and especially Leslie Cross. Now, there is some plausibility to that claim, although the answer is probably going to be very complicated. For example, for weeks, Andy Atkinson, Ronnie Lee, and myself ran 90-minute TikTok lives on the vegan pioneers. We looked at the vegan news and then the vegan journal in order of publication. And we did notice that by the time we got to the mid-1960s or so, there's no longer any mention of Leslie Cross. And also the society had begun to align itself with traditional animal welfare groups, such as Compassion in World Farming, who are not abolitionist. There were brief potted histories in the pages of the Vegan now and again, but again, Leslie Cross was absent, after the 60s. Cross had written that the Vegan Society is not so much welfare as liberation for the creatures and for the mind and heart of man. Not so much an effort to make the present relationship bearable, but an uncompromising recognition that it has to be abolished before something better and finer can be built. And he said the society has clearly come out on the side of the liberators. It is not so much welfare that we seek as freedom. Our aim is not to make the present relationship between man and animal more tolerable, but to abolish it. So perhaps the abolitionist statements like that, maybe they were thought too radical for those in charge of a moderating social movement organization, the Vegan Society. And therefore, perhaps it's the case that the whole of Cross's writings were quietly dropped and invisibilized. Now, if that is the case, and I don't know for sure, but there is evidence pointing that way, then this is a real bad indictment of the vegan movement, because Leslie Cross is without doubt a very significant part of the history of our movement.